forum.
All right, we have to approve our minutes from our May 23rd meeting. First of all. Does anybody have any questions, corrections, or changes for those minutes?
I do.
Okay,
At the June 13th meeting, we approved the minutes of May 23rd. But at the last meeting, June 13th, I had a couple of questions on the testimony of the applicant at that time. So these minutes have been done over. My question for staff is the changes that were made at the June 13th meeting are not reflected on these minutes in this packet.
They should be. I did make the corrections that you.
They're not. I mean, I would think they would be universal and by this time they would be done, but they're not. So I'm going to mention them again. On page 6 of the May 23rd meetings, on June 13th, I had made a change in the next to last paragraph. Member O'Brien noted that it was not in the purview of the Planning and Zoning Commission to engage in, not to ensure. It should be to engage in. Okay. And on page 8, at the very top, second line, middle, the word perfectly should be removed. That embellishment is not related to anything.
Which line is that?
Page 8, second line from the top, middle of the line, the word perfectly. Those are the only ones I have. But it would be interesting to find out why these changes on this, in this packet, were not made when they were made on the June 13th. This is the June 13th, and I have them noted, and then when I got for today's, they're still not corrected.
Member O'Brien, there are a variety of changes that you did request that were made in the minutes. And they are reflected in the minutes as stated on May 23. Including the values of the projects put forward by the applicant, those values were added. And a number of other edits that were requested by you. I apologize for the word for the ensuring the language that you just mentioned was included.
Yeah, I had a mark.
I question because the amounts which were material to that particular applicant, and the reason they were material is because the applicant did not want to spend $43,000 to meet or get closer to the required amount of parking places. However, they were willing to spend $65,000 on a lavatory in each salon. And he had already received estimates for that. That was not in the best interest of Homewood. I acknowledge you made those corrections, but these other two corrections were not made.
Understood, those changes can be made.
anybody else have any other questions?
I just have one
Yes, sir.
comment about, it seems like and I don't think Noah was here at the time, but I think we had one board meeting discussion on the length and need for minutes to be taken. And it sort of seems like they're getting longer and longer, which means the staff is spending more and more time trying to incorporate everything that we said. And I think one of the points that we made at that time was that because these meetings are recorded, we should focus on summarizing so that we don't get stuck with changes and miss the forest with the trees, especially if it's something material, as you just mentioned. So I would just encourage the staff to sort of keep that in mind, that we don't need, word for word transcripts, written down of what happened at what's everybody. I see, for myself, I see a number of comments that I made that to me are not necessarily significant, but it makes it easier on you, the staff, rather than having to sit there and regurgitate from recordings what the minutes, what was actually said. A short summary is better. It takes the stress off of you.
Yeah, I remember that meeting, and we had 3 models of different types of minutes that we reviewed, and we all agreed that a verbatim one was not required, and we agreed on the one that was the summary.
Right.
It seems like we're floating back to verbatim.
We just want
Good
to
observation.
Yeah, we just want to keep the stress off of the staff.
Okay. All right, if no other corrections or changes, I will ask for a motion to approve the minutes as corrected for the May 23rd meeting.
So moved.
O'Brien, do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Second, Bransky. Roll call.
Okay, Member Bransky,
Yes.
member Cap,
Abstain.
member O'Brien,
Yes.
member Johnson,
I think I have to abstain too, because I wasn't here for that. Yeah, I think,
Yep.
yeah,
correct.
okay.
Member Castaneda,
Yes, that's the one I was here for, yes. Mhm.
Chair Surzaga.
Yes.
All right, the minutes are approved.
All right, moving on to the minutes from the June 13th meeting. Anything there? Nothing for those minutes, so we'll accept them as presented, I take it.
Mr. Chairman, I'll move to accept the minutes of the June 13th meeting as presented.
Okay, member Cap, do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Second by O'Brien. Roll call.
All right, so member Bransky,
Yes.
member Cap,
Yes.
member O'Brien,
Yes.
member Johnson,
Yes.
member Castaneda,
Abstain.
Chair Surzaga.
Abstain.
Right, the minutes are approved.
We have some people in the audience. Does anybody in the audience have any questions or comments that they would like to make? If you do, I'd ask you to stand and state your name and address. No?
Can I get the comment, an introduction?
Yeah,
We have a trustee, or our trustee, in the audience who is now going to be the new liaison to the planning and zoning commission. I'd like to introduce you.
oh, okay. Well, welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I'm Philip Mason, from 1549 Willow Road, and I was appointed trustee about 2 months ago. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Congratulations.
I've been to a few of these meetings before, and so I can understand how it goes, but I was looking forward to just sitting in and listening and assisting with you guys in any way I can. So appreciate all that you do. And it's a pleasure to meet you all.
Well, thank you.
Sorry you got your short straw.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so now we're gonna continue the meeting till July 11th.
Yeah, we don't really have to continue it. It's been published for July 11th, the complete case, which is the special use and the variance, will be heard at the next meeting on the 11th.
Okay, so for the people in the audience, we're not going to be discussing the pending case that's going to be continued until Thursday, July 11th, 7 p.m. So you're all welcome to come back. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. So anything else for us to be aware of? Before we adjourn?
Well,
We do have a hearing case this evening.
Text them.
Gotta continue it.
The text.
Okay, so we're gonna continue the case to July, and you said we don't have to vote on it?
Yeah, but we do have the second case, which is continued from the last meeting for the text amendment.
From a formal point of view, it should be heard tonight. If it's gonna be heard July 9th, we should take a formal vote, should we not, to continue it?
Well, we published for it, so we published that new date, so we don't need to take a formal vote. It kind of starts over, starts something over. It's not really gonna be continued anymore. It's gonna be a new fresh.
But it's on the agenda tonight, and there is a recommendation to continue it.
It's going to be a new.
Okay,
So we're not going to discuss the text amendment? Is that
That
what
we
you're-
are going.
No, we are.
That's
We are.
We are going to do the text amendment.
The text amendments we are going to discuss tonight.
Okay, so that is case number 2415, text amendment to allow indoor commercial places of assembly in M1 limited manufacturing zoning district as a special use. Amend parking standards for place of assembly uses. Legal notice was published in the May 30th edition of the Southtown. Have we heard any comments from anybody?
No, not at this time.
Okay, so you're gonna make the presentation, Noah?
Correct.
All right. All yours.
Is this monitor supposed to be on as well? Usually it is.
Yeah. It's not on.
Just in case somebody can't see the.
I've never turned it on or off.
I know.
Usually.
Fabulous.
I know, sorry.
Thank you for.
Can you see that? I can't see with the angle on that, right?
It's gonna take it a minute to brighten up, I think,
Okay,
because it just turned on.
great. Okay, wait. Just a couple seconds for that to start here. Yes. Alright, so this evening we'll just be discussing a pair of text amendments that are going to go hand in hand with one another. And I'll try to keep this fairly brief, but I want to just kind of set a baseline for what exactly we're looking at this evening. We're looking at the first one, which is an amendment to allow indoor commercial place of assembly, both its smaller variant and its larger variant in the M1 limited manufacturing zoning district. And then an amendment to adjust off-street parking requirements for all place of assembly uses. So that includes indoor and outdoor commercial places of assembly and indoor and outdoor non-commercial places of assembly. To accommodate increased parking for use of fixed seating and provide some use-specific modifications for parking that we'll talk about in moments. So just place of assembly has been a term that's been thrown around in a number of cases this year. And I wanted to quickly brief on what places of assembly are, which is just our broad use category for any place where the use itself gives people an initiative to gather together to use the building together. So you see our different categories there. They range from everything like in private indoor recreation facilities to public buildings like public auditoriums, private movie theaters. Places of worship, a very broad set of categories, and you'll see that there's a table in the report that gives you kind of a list of what's included in different use categories and what isn't, just for reference on what uses fall in each category. And the one we're going to spend the most time with this evening is the commercial indoor places of assembly, and so that is your places, again, indoor recreation centers, event centers, theaters, the kinds of experiential retail, the kind of production studios where you have gatherings of people, a variety of different spaces. That all fall into a single category. So we'll look at this first amendment, is these indoor commercial places of assembly uses in the M1 zoning district. This is the language of the recommendation that we'll be looking at, so it would be allowing those uses as a special use, meaning that any instance of this use would have to get approval by or recommendation of approval by the Planning and Zoning Commission and approval by the Village Board of Trustees in order to operate there. So the current language is, there is none. It is a prohibited use, right now, it is not included, in that category. It is permitted in our larger commercial districts, and then in our smaller scale, our lower intensity commercial districts, like B1 and B2, it's a special use currently as well. So the proposal is just to add 2 letters, to allow them with a special use permit. So again, this would not allow uses to freely operate there. They would have to receive a special use permit in order to operate in any building in the M1 zone. So we've looked at this amendment for a couple reasons. It's one that even outside of any cases that might be considered in the near future, it's something that we wanted to take a look at. And the main arguments are these, that there are the indoor commercial place of assembly is the type of use that's quite a bit higher intensity than we would like generally in our residential districts. The M1 district is largely reserved for the types of uses that we generally screen from residential uses, and then also are related to generally related to industrial uses, but also just generally need larger amounts of space. The ways that we zone the district kind of reflect that purpose of the district, and we think that this use is in alignment with that purpose. The M1 zoning district provides some suitable locations for these uses. They generally need large, flexible, uninterrupted spaces with good regional accessibility, but not necessarily the same commercial frontage as, say, a B3, B4 district. And so the M1 district provides maybe some more suitable locations for these types of uses to consider. There's an existing building stock in some of our redevelopment areas in the M1 zone that are appropriate for this type of use. It increases the opportunities for some unique and economically productive uses. Again, we're looking at indoor commercial places of assembly. These are places that are in alignment with being taxable uses, as we generally look for in the M1 zoning district. Are again creating economic activity, something that we want to see in that district. We want to see those in locations without adverse impacts on sensitive uses. So this allows a contextually appropriate way to integrate those uses into the community without impacts on sensitive uses, residential, maybe some of our smallest scale commercial, things like that. It positions, it positions some sites for, again, maybe some future redevelopment. It increases the number, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of my words. We're also seeing an increase in the number of applications for this type of use. You've probably seen that already with a couple of uses considered this year. And there's been some requests through economic development and planning for the potential for including these uses in M1 zones. You see that particularly along 175th Street and some of the buildings along there on the kind of towards where we zone for B4, but still in the M1 zone, some of those office areas, they're kind of flex industrial commercial spaces. So it's been something of increasing interest and something that we should take a look at. And then by proposing a special use with this amendment, it ensures that we still allow for that planning and zoning commission discretion. Because it's such a broad use category, not every indoor commercial place of assembly is appropriate for the M1 zone, but some may be more appropriate than others. And the special use designation allows us to make that determination on a case-by-case basis, which staff thinks is appropriate for the types of uses that we're looking at. I also want to point out that this is pretty common in other communities, including ones that are very close to us. It is common for uses that fall in our indoor commercial place of assembly category to be located in areas that are industrially zoned. So I first include one that's farther away from us, but is one I passed every day for about 5 years. It's an event center that's in a pretty heavy warehousing and industrial district. And it functions very well. It has, the site gives it appropriate parking and screens it from being your residential uses for larger events and things like that. It works very well at that site. But then I chose some local examples that also could work. So that would be the types of uses we would have in the indoor commercial places of assembly. So Paul Mitchell School of Cosmetology would be technically a learning center. It would be, it's a cosmetology school, people are coming together for the purpose of instruction. In Tinley Park, they approved this in a large warehouse building, near I-80, just down the freeway from us, a couple miles, 2 or 3 miles. Same, different industrial area, but the same use category, Tinley Park. All-Star Athletic Gym and Gymnastics Center, which does private events and then also has open gymnastic hours. So it's an indoor recreation facility, as we would classify it. That's located in an industrially zoned area. It's in a flex building there that used to be used for industrial uses and is now this kind of hybrid use. And then it shows one from Plainfield, Illinois. There's a Standard X Future Gallery. It's a large kind of production area that also has experiential retail, kind of an art gallery style space. With that in mind, we would classify that as an indoor commercial place of assembly use in Homewood. And so it's another example of that kind of use zone in an industrial zone. You can see the context for that one. It's surrounded by other warehouses as well. So that is the scope of the First Amendment. It's very minor. It's just to allow those uses, again, both size categories or square footage categories of indoor commercial places of assembly in our M1 zoning district as a special use. There's a broader amendment we want to look at adjacent to this, which is important to visit if we're going to consider anything related to expanding where a use is allowed. And that is looking at the parking for place of assembly uses.
Should we stop and?
Oh, sure, that actually makes a lot of sense. Sure. We can definitely pause and discuss the merits of the special use.
Anybody on the board have any questions or comments they'd like to bring up at this time?
It seems to make sense to me. And I'm thinking of one case in particular that was out here on Harwood, if you remember the building, the guy wanted to do the event center parties, and then he wanted to get up on the roof, and there's like no way that building would have supported anything up on the roof. And I'm thinking of that case alone, why the special use is kind of the saving grace. Proposed uses like that. So this makes perfect sense to me, and it makes sense to drive businesses like this. Like you said, screening them from residential, screening them from commercial, because you certainly, even if that building could have supported it, you wouldn't have wanted that kind of parking problem over there, which is already complicated. And then we had the whole salon thing over there behind Blueberry Hill. I mean,
Right.
So, you know, the density of the area can't support that, whereas in the M1 it can, and if you've got empty units, great way to fill a unit. So I don't have a problem with it so far, barring any weird details that we've covered it.
I think that particular building was purchased by a construction company. And they made some major improvements, so it looks very nice. Anybody else?
Yeah, makes sense to me.
We're putting an S on others, we might as well put an S on that one, right? But
I have a question with regards to, well, in the materials, it indicated that you have had a number of requests in the M1. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Why haven't those requests been formulated into a case and progressed along, such as case 2411?
Right, so case 2411 is one of those. There's been a lot of the, I guess, proposals, I would say, have been kind of preliminary proposals of asking about the potential of spaces. I know there's a couple spaces on 175th that have interest in, say, learning centers and things like that. But again, either the use has been prohibited, it falls in our commercial place of assembly, and so we can't bring it forward because it's a prohibited use, or the use, it's just a kind of getting some understanding of what's going on in Homewood, telling us their business interest, but they haven't taken it forward to a formal business plan and a formal proposal. So it's a variety of different reasons.
They
Okay.
don't see. They don't, because it's not permitted in the code, usually people don't take that extra step
Right.
to want to pursue that amendment.
I don't have any problem with regards to the M1 district being modified and amended. I do have a question, however, that since we had an applicant come up and now we are reshaping the zoning code, are we doing that because of the applicant? Is the application driving the zoning code amendments?
In part it is, yeah. Because without the amendment, that case cannot go forward, so it may not have come for our attention were it not for that applicant pursuing that particular space.
Okay,
Yes.
so the parking amendment
Mhm.
is based upon a general change of having a modification or an amendment to the M1 district, not specifically because of the parking demand of the applicant in case 2411.
Right, the parking consideration is just, as we look at this broader use category, and because we've had conversations even with. Members up here at the Planning and Zoning Commission regarding some major changes to parking requirements for places of assembly. Bill, I know you brought up the example of St. John Neumann Church. I know that there were other examples brought up, like when we did Honeycomb Hideout, the event center back in January for special use. That's been an ongoing conversation that we need to address the parking standard for places of assembly, so.
So yeah, the parking is not related necessarily to this case, but it is something that should be addressed if we're going to look at this on any level. This now is the time to look at it.
Okay, I have another question. Homewood is a landlocked community and the lots themselves are landlocked. You can't really expand. The consultant that was in for the modification of the zoning code, one of the recommendations was to reduce the square footage for individual R1, R2 categories, districts. My concern is, how is it to be handled when in the new code, we increased by 1 foot the width of the parking stall? St. John that you mentioned, if they were to redo their parking lot, new work, not ceiling, because that's maintenance, they would lose 14 parking places. Take any of the big box stores on Halsted Street that were prior to the change of the zoning code. I assume they are all 8 feet. They may not be. I'd have to go back and take a look. But the general question is, let's say that Menards, just to take an example, is 8 feet. And 3 years from now, they're going to redo their parking lot for whatever reason, just for sake of discussion. And it has to go to 9 feet. They're going to lose X number of parking spaces. When that occurs, what occurs at that point? Are they grandfathered in? What is the impact in the future of the reduction in large areas of the parking spaces?
I don't believe we changed the width of the parking spaces. I think it was 9 feet in the old code as well.
It went from 8 to 9 feet. Oh, that's my question. What is the impact of that change in the future?
Well, it's considered an existing non-conformity unless they change a certain percentage of it. So if they were to redevelop the entire site, they would have to comply with the new standards. If they were just to, or if they were to expand it beyond an extra 50% or an extra 30%, then they would have to comply. If they're just gonna resurface it, then they can stay with the same striping. and the
No,
same-
I'm talking about new work, something that would trigger, if they have 8 feet now, they would have to go to 9 feet.
Yeah. it would be-
Is that something that we could give them a variance on, or would that be sticking our neck out way too far, not in our purview?
They could ask for variance.
So if they're just going to reseal and then restripe. And it's currently 8 feet, they could do the 8 feet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if it's the same,
That's
use
maintenance.
in the same parking
Right.
space, yes.
Yeah, it's different. It's made.
But if they tear up the parking lot and resurface it,
It's still the same parking lot. It's not a new parking lot.
but the question is it still 8 feet or is it now 9 feet?
It's the same existing parking lot, the same use, and it's still gonna comply with the existing vehicle code. It wouldn't have to meet the new standards.
I don't recall the discussion around the change. What drove the increase of 1 foot? Because I mean, if that doesn't meet typical standards. I mean, if the 8 feet is still the standard, why did we go 9?
Well, 9 feet is generally the accepted standard in most engineering manuals, it's 9 feet.
Is it?
I looked at that for a previous project with a previous employer about a year ago, that it's about 9 feet. Or not about, it is 9 feet. You'd be hard pressed to find a community today that's approving parking spaces less than 9 feet. That's an engineering standard.
City of Chicago.
Could be.
Hmm.
City of
Yeah,
Chicago
or-
That's a
functions little
whole
differently than everybody
That's
else.
the great
They
thing.
have parking
City of
spaces.
Chicago.
Great thing.
Yeah.
Hey,
I don't want to drift off into that conversation, but it's something we should come back to at some point.
Yeah.
Well, it's a good point because what it shows is that in this amendment that we're about to get the details on. There are other aspects of it that it could be changing that we might not be thinking of, so you gotta kind of
Well,
watch what we're
you
doing.
mentioned St. John. Okay, St. John has in the middle of the parking lot 4 rows of 22 each. And around those 4 rows are traffic lanes. If you increase the 8 feet width over there to 9 feet, that's adding 22 feet to each lane. And that eliminates the traffic lane going around. So they have to reconfigure the grid, which is exactly what Menards or Jewel or whoever would have to do if their places are 8 feet. And at some point, they're going to have to replace new work of their parking lot. So therefore, they would, the reason I'm asking this is because we've gone to a hybrid. And it seems to be a reasonable approach and one that's used around the country. If they are losing, anybody is going to be losing parking places because they're going to comply with the new zoning code of 9 feet. How much are they going to lose? And what does that mean? Are we going to have to later on think of another hybrid? Or will this fit? In other words, do we have to modify this moving forward? I don't want to delay this. But
I mean,
Now I'm gonna have to
that
go
would
measure
like any
my
other
parking
special
places.
use, right? I mean, if you're, yeah, all this is, you asked a question earlier about, the impact, what, for example, might be driving, an applicant to come in and we have to consider changes in the text amendment. But that's what we talked about when we were adopting the new code. That is that future changes, that there's no way we could be perfect, that we couldn't get, we couldn't get a perfect standard, whether it's 8.5 feet or 9 feet. But that it was gonna be driven by demand, necessity, by cases or matters being bought by them, by cases that we're having in front of us. That's the way it should, that's the way statutes, rules, ordinances get changed. They're driven by that kind of thing, so I don't see. I mean, we'll have to consider it. So the board will have to just say, well, you know, we don't like this and it's hurting too many, impacting too many businesses, and maybe we ought to be doing something else, or maybe we just bring a special use.
I just want to inject this as a point of discussion and reference. I think we'll have to take care of it further down the road.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. It's probably right.
I guess all that to say, there's additional things that, you know, as they're called to attention here, especially related to, you know, parking space dimensions, some of these other things. We can take a closer look at it. We would probably need some time to go take a look at the old code, go kind of study that, but, you know, we always take these things into account and look into them. And we welcome that this time as well.
Right. Anybody else?
No. Don't walk through that parking.
All right, so now you want to do parking?
Thank you for the examples. Those are great.
Thank you.
Taking the time to do that, really.
All right, we're looking at, then the parking amendments that I mentioned, this is for all places of assembly, and we'll dive right into that. So, here's the amendment language that you'll find at the end of the memo, of what specifically is being requested. Amending that parking table for place of assembly uses, to provide increased parking for uses with fixed seating or providing a trigger for uses with fixed seating. And then some use specific modifications that I'll jump into. So right now, as we discussed last week, talking about some parking related challenges with another place of assembly use. The current standard is 1 space per 300 square feet of gross floor area for all place of assembly uses, and that's for all 4 categories. That's the table from the code right there, and you'll see that it just encompasses all of those uses at all. So yes.
I have a question. I just want to clarify, should that not be O1 rather than O2? Because O1 are off-street parking standards.
Is O1,
It's O1, okay.
table O1C.
All right, we'll have to modify the proposed amendment language then to reflect that. So the so 1 space per 300. Proposing a new or changes to the table that includes modified place of assembly use ratio. So we're looking at, as the recommendation is stated, and I'll dive into some justification around it. 1 space per 250 square feet of gross floor area, contrast that to the current 300 square feet of gross floor area, plus 1 space per 4 fixed seats. And you'll see that's reflected for indoor and outdoor spaces. And then for the schools, we currently don't include them in our code. Or at least they're not clearly stated as to what the standard is for schools for our parking ratio. So some standards that are fairly close to industry practices, and I'll talk a little bit about that, are included here of 1 space per 250 square feet, similar to the other place of assembly uses, plus visitor parking, so 1 per 10, which is a general kind of ITE standard for elementary and junior high schools, and then 1 per 4 students for high schools. And again, we'll dive a little bit into the specifics of that in the next couple slides. So why this amendment? Why is this parking standard being brought forward? I know we already talked a little bit about whenever we consider use modifications, we need to look at parking, we need to look at other I guess characteristics of the use, other regulations to ensure that everything fits together. But also it's been brought up a couple times this year for a couple other reasons. First is that it addresses a major parking deficiency at larger places of assembly, particularly those with fixed seating. There's a example on the right here. I think the number should be modified slightly from 160, talking to Bill, who's a member of this church, but it's a roughly 160 spaces. I think the correct number, the exact number after doing even further digging after this presentation plan is about 147 spaces by the old code, which had a little bit more stringent of a standard for parking for this type of use for places of worship. Currently today, with all the buildings on the site, it is 54 spaces. So you can see that that is about 60% drop in the number of spaces required for that use. And if you look in the packet, I included a couple other examples. An event center that had about a 50% drop in the number of spaces required. And then some other, if you were to take a industry standard use, put it into the put it in Homewood and put it to the old and new parking standards, you can see some of the drops that happen for other uses, indoor recreation, some other uses that are included in that table. So it's something we really do need to address, or at least be mindful of when thinking about parking standards for place of assembly uses. It also responds to some peak hour parking deficiencies. That's where you see the slight modification from the 1 to 300 standard. There's certain types of uses such as event centers, which we talked about at this commission, that have had, that have challenges with peak parking. When you have an intermittent use of very high peaks of parking. We can't necessarily always, park for every possible contingency, but we can be mindful of, what these peaks look like in practice. And so there's been some parking standard modifications related to some of those experiences, as they've experienced with event centers at Homewood. It more accurately ties parking capacity to fixed seating capacity. So we're generally thinking about the total users and the total number of trips to these uses by the number of fixed seats in these spaces, where they're present. And so there's a thought to modify the standard to reflect that. It maintains that broad and flexible building category for place of assembly uses, which helps because these uses vary so much. It can be hard to pin down and create use categories for every single one. We would still have uses that fall outside of those. So this gives us the ease of zoning administration when it comes to assigning standards to really unique uses, like you find in place of assembly category right now. It aligns parking standards to the ITE standards, the Institute of Transportation Engineers. Those standards, they publish a transportation planning handbook that includes a parking generation manual. It includes ratios, recommended standards for parking for individual sites based on what they anticipate parking demand being in those. So I included some data on those standards in the packet. And then also the peer community best practices, looking at some of the communities around us, looking at how they park, and then maybe modifying our ratio slightly to be more in alignment with what other communities who are doing good land use practices are doing as well. And then it establishes that standard for schools. It provides some clarity where the staff believes the code needs a little bit more clarity. Say we get a new school project in the future, a school modification, we can be thinking about the parking standard more clearly for those projects. That was discussed at a previous meeting, and that guidance is from staff has been reflected in this recommendation. So to summarize both, or I guess this was kind of the summary for the whole case 2415, is these two amendments. Obviously amending the second one for the correct table number, my apologies. And then the special use recommendation that was part of the first recommendation we discussed. But that is the extent of the parking recommendation being considered here. Obviously with other items such as parking space dimensions, things like that. These are things we're happy to research and look into as well and consider for future amendments. But so this is the scope of what we're looking at this evening.
I'm a little confused.
Okay.
So you showed that back on the table with the wrong number, whatever number table it is, changing from one space per 300 square feet down to one per 250. You were talking about how we're seeing drops in required spaces. So I take it the gist is that we don't want to see drops in required spaces. We want to see increases, because if you're going from 1 per 300 down to 1 per 250, you're gonna see an increase in spaces.
Right.
So am I understanding that right? Am I following that right?
Correct. So it's to
Okay.
respond to, so let's say we get a new church project that comes in and says, I want to build a church in Homewood and I have, 400 seats and a couple thousand square feet. The goal of this is that project will have an increase in the number of parking spaces provided for it. Responding to the fact that if we kept the current code, their parking would be very much smaller than what is generally recommended for churches and similar uses.
So considering Bill's point about every parcel in Homewood is basically landlocked, that this is really gonna put a handcuff on the developer that he needs to make his building size work with the parking requirements. If he's putting a new building or if he's adding on to a building, whatever. Cause now we're making the parking requirement harder to obtain or to achieve. We're making it tougher, right?
So yes and no. So generally to trigger these requirements where you'd have to meet them and have to do, it kind of came up in the previous item. you would have to modify your parking lot to a certain extent, you would have to, or there'd have to be a change in use. You wouldn't see, for example, somebody goes to, how do I wanna say this? Our code is written to be kind of kind to redevelopment and to be mindful of the constraints around redevelopment. So this would generally be, where you'd see this the most is for a new development coming in, or for, again, a site seeing a major, I guess, redevelopment project, complete redevelopment. But it would generally, yes, increase the number of spaces that would be required on the site. Not, I don't think to an onerous degree, but I think one that is more reflective of the number of trips that'll be happening at those sites. It does, I guess, in theory, make site fit a little bit more of a challenge, but it's meant to kind of remedy, maybe not go all the way back to the 2021 standard and or beyond that, but to kind of start to recalibrate that back towards a number that's probably a little bit more in line with the trips you would actually see to that use.
Angelica.
Yeah, I have a couple of points of clarification. So anytime there's a change in land use, the new parking is triggered, and then also if it's a change in intensity of use. So if this use were something that required only 1 per 300 and we're coming in, they're gonna have to accommodate for more spaces. Those are the two triggers. And also, we do have that, the article doesn't require additional parking for uses in buildings existing in the effective date of the ordinance, which is January 10th. So any building that's existing, unless there's a change in the land use, so say we change it from in this case, like a church to a school, then they would have to meet school standards because the use is changing. But if it's just being used as the same use and the building's already existing, then there's no new parking standards. The other thing I want to clarify is that is 1 space for 250 or 1 space for 4 fixed seats, whichever is greater. That's our recommendation.
Oh, that's good way.
We're not gonna
Showing
require
there,
that
you
1
wouldn't think
for
that.
250 plus.
Yeah.
Plus 1. That would be a lot of spaces.
Mhm. Or 1 per 3 seats, right? Whichever's great for communities.
I have a combination of questions and comments. I think this was, have to commend you on once again, the thoroughness of how you approach this. I think this is good. However, I do have some questions and, as I say, comments. I liked the approach that you take, that's reported on page 35, which focuses on peak uses. I mean, that is something that really, when it comes down to it, that's where we zero in on. Peak uses of a particular use might overwhelm a calculation of things in a non-peak use. Under the second grouping of fixed seats and other secondary spaces are related, item 2, paragraph B, you talk about, once again, this is for a place of worship, and we're using St. John Neumann as our example here. You're using primary worship area. So in your example, you could go to the slide because I want to make a point. If you would, please.
Which one? Oh,
That
this one right here.
Okay, so it says, somewhere there it says 160 spaces. I don't disagree whatsoever with that. However, what you're alluding to here on page 35, and then it comes up again throughout page 37, whatever, you do mention carefully that we have to worry about other high intensity uses that may, you don't really say may or may not correspond, but my point is you should. in using this particular situation as the example, this is a calculation for worship space, but I'm here to tell you that if this might be an example for traditional churches or places of worship for illustrating this parking requirement, you really have to take into account the fact that on Sunday, a day of worship, you might have Sunday school. So the school, I'm here to tell you, is occupied on Sundays, overlapping or coinciding with the hours of the liturgy, and that imposes another series of demands on the parking lot. And then equally, there's a combination gym social hall, which is also a place of assembly and you know, a certain square footage. Certainly it accommodates different activities and different uses, but my point is, even in situations like this, and you know, you allude to it on page 35, but you sort of take yourself out of it. And what I'm trying to suggest here is that using this particular case as the example, the actual parking requirement is a lot higher than 160 spaces, only because there are coincidental uses in these other spaces. And we have to be aware of them. It's like, to use the analogy, I think I pointed out in some of our last meetings that how we evaluate multi-tenant use buildings and multi-tenant uses, it's almost as if somebody has to keep a table, a spreadsheet of the use, the square footage, and what the parking requirement is. Is it 1 per 250? Is it 1 per 300? Blah, blah, blah. Well, similarly, in using this as an example, I'm just drawing everybody's attention to that. You address this, you specifically address it on page 35. But like I say, I don't think you push it hard enough, and you actually don't draw the conclusion that there very well may be peak uses on the peak day that actually pump up the parking requirements considerably. And like I say, this particular case, the school would add a significant amount of parking requirement, and the social hall would as well.
But you're not saying it would be our job or somebody else's job to figure out, for example, whether it's St. John Newman or a theater where auditoriums where actors have to come in and practice and hours before, or participants hours before, and then you have the audience coming in later. That would mean we'd be sitting around trying to assess how on one Sunday or one Saturday night the space is going to be used. I get your point, though.
I'm not here to pick on churches, places of worship.
No, that's not my point.
You know, I'm pointing out that this example is good, but it's, I would say, incomplete. And I would also say there may be applicability, maybe, I'm not quite sure, because we haven't seen all of the details of the presentation for the case we're going to look at in the M1 zone, but there may be a combination of what would be a special or a permitted use for what we're considering, that when you add them all up, it changes not just the analysis, but potentially changes the approval. And again, you know, what are the odds of, I mean, really? What are the odds of hitting the peaks simultaneously? Well, depends on the location, it depends on the use, it depends on the surrounding uses, I get it. We had that one case. I think it's the 815 Maple building next to the old Harley Davidson, the old, just,
Oh,
I apologize. Right, but my point is, you know, we were, and the applicant, I think, was saved by the bell because his security cameras, rather than have somebody sitting out there counting cars, the security cameras provided the perfect record for the peak hours. And, you know, I'm not belaboring the point that we consider peak hours of operation most often in our deliberations, but all I'm saying is, and I mean, it's no harm, no foul in this particular case. I mean, this is the background information that you've provided us. I'm just essentially, I guess I could say, finding fault with your conclusion. You know, you say we got to worry about peak hours of operation, but I'm here to tell you that I just gave you an example of, well, you didn't really carry that example through on the example you used. That's all.
So if I can just if I can ask for a clarification, looking at the place of worship example, I know we're really fixated on places of worship, but it is a unique use and that it generally has one or two very, very high peaks in a given week, and there's something that they're notoriously challenging to park. So you're saying that when we look on page 35, so there's a recommendation thinking about, we need to think about, I mentioned this idea of square footage, you mentioned the Sunday schools, the social halls, things like that, as being considered secondary to kind of the primary worship space.
I didn't say that, you did. You said, I think, aren't you saying on
Yeah, right.
page 35 that uses like that are secondary to the?
Right, well, so you're saying the opposite of what I was going to say is that you're saying that those shouldn't be considered secondary, there's a disagreement in the.
Well, no, I'm not quibbling over words, but what I'm saying is that. And maybe we are quibbling over words, you know, what I'm trying to say is when you add up peak uses, when they occur, that is how it is, you know, it's not a matter of primary and secondary, we're adding together peak uses simultaneously.
You almost gave the remedy right in your comment, because you said, just like a mixed use, you almost have to have a table.
Well, yeah,
figure
that's
out-
all, yeah,
But that can be applied into the amendment and say, if you've got
Absolutely.
secondary or accessory buildings on that site. Then you have to give us an aggregate or a table.
Right.
To show us
Right.
how your
could not,
demand is
with
going
you.
to fluctuate.
Right.
could not agree with you more.
And the general argument, and it's why it's recommended in the IT manual, generally, they also provide a recommendation for square footage, but they generally recommend that it's done by seats. Is because of the reasoning that I have here, is that when you have Sunday schools, generally they are attending a service in that church, the capacity of the maximum number of people who are going to be at a space.
Well, but see,
are
it
the people who are
depends,
attending.
on the congregation and, you know, I'm gonna go use the word use, you know, I presume, you know, I'm a member of St. John Neumann. I happen to teach, what people religious ed.
Sure.
So I'm here to tell you, I struggle to find a parking space. On Sunday morning because of issues like this. We have all of these peak demands
Right.
happening at the same time, and I'm not here to pick on churches and places of worship, but all I'm saying is you don't have to amend page 35, but just we, all of us collectively going forward, just have to be aware and keep in mind that peak uses are additive when they occur simultaneously, whether they're considered primary or secondary or ancillary or, you know, whatever description you provide.
I guess my question with respect to that is
Does that make sense?
that something,
Makes sense.
is that something that we consider on an individual basis at the planning and zoning meeting? Or is it something we need to have written into the code,
It's not,
make those changes?
it's something that's considered each time a new use comes in, we do an evaluation
Right.
at a staff level.
Right,
And so we will determine based on square footage, based on seating, whatever the standard is, how employees, whatever the standard is, we will get the number of how many spaces are required at that point.
right. And then when they come before us, we can.
But they
Yeah,
don't always come
But,
before.
right, but, right, so when they don't come before us, then what is our role? We have no role, right, so that's why I'm
Yeah.
having question, problems following this.
Yeah.
Right, but it provides guidance, your recommendation this evening and then the village board's decision.
Right.
Gives us the guidance, I guess that is your role, is to guide us and what is the best way to park these sites, and is this an appropriate amendment to use to park these sites, so.
For
For
the
peak,
individual.
for peak, right, for peak usage on and off this has been discussed, it's as simple as that.
So in the First Amendment, we're talking about special use case, so we have the power to ask for the data to make an informed decision to set the requirement. But this amendment, correct me if I'm wrong, if you're applying it to all places of assembly, no matter what district, this doesn't automatically turn them into a special use.
Right.
So there's gonna be cases where special use is not part of it and not applied, and we don't have the power to enforce something unique because of the site uniqueness or the use uniqueness or multiple
Right.
buildings on a site.
Right, which is why the standard, it's
So-
particularly important to get the language of the standard right, because it's the standard
Right.
that will measure non-planning and zoning committees.
So we have to catch that in the standard because we aren't always gonna have that power up here be a special use.
Right,
So doing something like Mike was kind of suggesting that. Hey, if you've got multiple buildings on your site, we need to know what your aggregate or your gross or whatever your peak. A better, deeper explanation of what the parking draw is really gonna be, or parking demand is really gonna be. That needs to get worded into the standard. I think that's kind of your point, right? Make.
Well, no, my point
Yeah.
is, and I made it, and I said it was analogous to a discussion we might have had on a multi-tenant building with multiple and different uses, that in situations like that, somebody, and I'm not insisting or even suggesting that we need to encumber our ordinance with something like that, but all I'm saying is somebody needs to have a table, a spreadsheet that accounts for this.
So like the place that wanted space in Southgate, that wanted to do teaching, therapy.
Right.
And then they were gonna say, and then they said, oh, and every few weeks we're gonna have an event,
Right,
like a something.
Exactly.
Okay, well, your event's gonna have this huge number
Crazy,
of crazy
yeah.
thing, so it was like out of control, and so, yeah, so how do we work into the amendment to control something like that if it's not a special use?
well, I mean, I think we're all in agreement here that somebody, staff, I presume,
It's the staff.
just keep
Yeah.
track of this.
I have charts for all.
Yeah, and I'm not finding fault with what's being done. Please don't misunderstand me by any means. I'm just saying that, in my opinion, there's, I mean, the best of intentions of adopting a new zoning code that contemplates ideas like this, concepts like this, and
So I will say I have charts on all the use of the buildings, as much as I can keep them up to date, and it was much more complicated under the old code.
sure,
For the reason that
not disagreeing with,
that we are, if you remember, our parking ordinance had every use in practically a different standard. And
Right.
when we changed the code, we tried to streamline that so that it was just by square footage, so that a multi-tenant building, all uses have the same square footage requirement, and you don't have to balance it that way. But I think that what we're asking here is that adequate parking, is it going to give us adequate parking?
well, see, I would take issue with what you just said about multi-tenant buildings. I thought we had a couple of cases where there were a couple of, however you describe, individual suites that had a
Because they were
different,
already parked to the max.
right? That's all. And again, I'm not finding fault. I'm not asking that anything be changed. I'm just encouraging us to remain alert to the need that when we examine things like this and we're looking, I mean, you draw our attention to it as you should on page 35, and you have another one on 37 and 39, you know, blah, blah, blah. You say peak uses. Couldn't agree with you more, but the point is you have to carry that concept through and apply it correctly through all the different combinations. Yeah, that's all.
Well, since we're talking about churches, it sounds like we're preaching to the choir. You understand that, right? So I think the point's been made.
Yeah.
Yeah. The state,
I would just like to add that the old code, I thought had a good approach, and that's the reason I like the hybrid that you have recommended. Because you have the or in there, one space for 4 fixed seats. If you go over to St. John, there's a plaque on the wall back in the church that says 925 occupancy. Well, that was decades ago. They've removed pews and they have portable mobile chairs. So the current, let's say it's 625. Okay, at 4, that would come out to be 150 something. So to me, it would be the principal building, the largest structure, which would be the church. There's 4 buildings over there. I'm just taking that as an example. There could be others in town. And if you have an activity in each one of the 4 buildings, I wouldn't count that way. I'd count the old way, the 625. Because you might have a committee meeting in one building, and in the school building, you might have religious education, which might be 60 people, and then you might have something else elsewhere. But the total of all those is not going to be the 625 upon which the parking requirement was calculated, the 4 seats per space. So
it gives you the flexibility.
Yeah.
Well, I'm saying, I'm agreeing with that, but I'm making the point that when simultaneous peak uses occur, they will be additive.
Yeah.
I think so, just to provide a couple of quick comments on some of the discussion happening here. So you, Bill, you make a great point on the stated capacity of a building. And that's a way that some communities park, that we looked at that in our analysis. It's recommended for some uses. The downside with that is kind of what you mentioned, when that number, let's say the fire code changes from, say, the 2012 to the 2018 IFC, or let's say that the you know, the, like you mentioned, just things about the building change, that number can change dramatically, even if the building itself didn't change all that much. And so that's a challenge of parking just purely by, say, fire capacity of a building, because that'll move around, and the parking standard can be kind of tough to nail down, even if the building itself did not change at all. As for the, you know, the peak uses, I think that, you know, I think some of that is a matter of kind of illustrating different cases. One place of worship, to use the example we've been using. Most people may say if it's one service, everyone may go to a service at, say, 9:30, and then we'll be in Sunday school at 11 to 12. Those uses largely kind of piggyback off one another, where people who are participating in the other uses going on. You can measure how many people will be there on a given Sunday generally by how many people can you fit in that room, in the place of worship, with the fixed seats or the main worship space, basically. And that's kind of where the thought comes from with this standard. Now, you can have uses or conditions like you have 2 services, you might have overlap where that use may increase. And I think that's what you're trying to say.
Absolutely.
Is that you might have then Sunday school going on while the church service is happening over here. And that's really, really hard to try to factor in. And then there's also a line that you have to think about, is what eventually becomes the church's responsibility to manage capacity. I grew up going to a place of worship where we had to move the second service later just to allow that parking lot, that kind of handoff to happen. Because to park it with, 100% of all the uses having it all the time, I mean, it was already a massive parking field, it was a 2,000 person church. It could be, I mean, it would take up a square mile of parking, and so we have to kind of balance that too, both. We do need to provide adequate parking for every use. We also want to make sure that, we're handling, I would say, you have to be careful with the absolute peak of peak uses, because then we can end up with a lot of extra parking that isn't getting used during the week. And again, isn't necessarily a productive use that could be put to something.
Could not agree more, but what's more embarrassing? Empty parking lots or out of capacity on the peak of peaks? How frustrating is that to people? How potentially unsafe is that if it encourages reckless and rash?
And you get
behavior?
spillover into
Right.
those neighborhoods,
Right.
commercial areas.
Right,
Yeah, the spillover problem is definitely one thing. I think some of that is just a matter of kind of it's not the church's responsibility to be thinking about how we think the village thinks about the highest and best use of land. Their job is to provide a church at an adequate capacity and with all of those things. And so,
But spillover into the neighborhood is definitely the church's.
It is.
Responsibility, they should think about that. That disrupts the-
Right.
That's right.
yeah,
So at the end of the day, all of this is about. It certainly shows that you are considering those factors.
right,
And it's also, it gives the flexibility to the church to come in and say, hey, this is why you should approve this or not approve it, right?
right.
They can make those arguments. You can make the assessments, with the guidance you've gotten here, or it appears that you already had.
Mhm.
And we deal with it on a case by case basis if it comes before us.
Right, because there's also.
So, right, we're not gonna there's nothing in what's said on page 35 that's gonna put us in a position where we haven't at least considered the factors that have been discussed here tonight.
Right.
Right.
I would also state that this is just a parking minimum. There is nothing that stops the church necessarily from adding more parking to, again, maybe avoid some of that embarrassment. Or for us, when we're doing the planning process, even if we have our zoning requirement, to still kind of make note of instances where we might see a special occurrence and kind of have conversations with the developer, see what can be done.
That's the nature of peak uses. There's no way to get it perfectly right, so.
We can't legislate a perfect ordinance.
Right.
There's going to be amendments.
Exactly.
It was an obvious omission and error in the new ordinance regarding the parking. And that's what we're discussing, and we're correcting it now with this amendment. It's that simple.
Right, exactly. Is that it?
That's- I think. it's-
Yep, I think it's. Commissioner Cap, did your questions get answered? I want
Yes.
to make sure that we.
once again, I don't really regard what I said contained any questions. It was more,
Oh,
it was more.
Or I guess,
It was comments.
sure,
Yeah.
okay,
I asked
I guess-
Angela a question if it made sense. That was
Okay.
it, yeah. But yes, you're responsive.
Okay.
So there is no perfect ordinance. And there never will be.
Nope. By the way, that change of the code 440502 to 01, that occurs on pages 21, 37, 38, and 39.
Very good.
Yeah, and this-
And we need to be stated correctly in our recommendation motion.
So, Mr. Chair, are we ready for?
No, nobody else have any other questions or comments? But I guess we are ready, Mr. Johnson. Are you going to make the motion?
I think we should vote on it separately.
it's a good idea.
Separate motions.
Separate?
Yep, that's good, it's a good idea.
Okay, so we'll do the first one first.
Somebody else can do that. Elizabeth's ready to do it. The first is-
Page 39.
Page 39.
One looking for the first one.
This one's-
Number one.
this one is just,
Somebody else goes.
Mr. Chairman, I move, that we approval of case 2415. The first, part of this is, that we amend table 4403-04 to permit indoor commercial place of assembly less than 5,000 square feet, and indoor commercial place of assembly greater than 5,000 square feet uses in the M1 limited manufacturing zoning district as a special use and incorporate our findings of fact into this record.
And do we have a second?
I have a question. Are
Yes.
we doing the findings of fact and the recommendation on pages 37 and 39? Is that what we're doing?
The motion,
The finding of the factor on 30 something.
right, I suppose it's kind of, there aren't separate findings of fact for each recommendation, so, I guess. Angela, I don't know what the best practice would be, but it maybe to group, it's. The language would be to group it into the first one, to approve the findings of fact, to approve the amendment for special use M1 zone. And then do the second recommendation in number 2.
We'll also include the same findings of fact.
Yeah.
That way they're included in both.
Okay.
It'll probably be in one ordinance with all approvals, if they're both recommended.
Well, findings of fact number 5 refers specifically to section 440502, which is 01. So we could exclude that from the first.
that one needs to be changed.
Or just correct that.
I guess my question is, the findings of fact on page 37 will apply to both votes, correct?
Correct, yeah,
And on 39, the recommendation will apply to both.
Yeah.
Votes,
yes,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, with that in mind, the findings of fact number 1, the zoning ordinance is dated January 10th. And it's the 11th on page 37.
What you're saying was adopted on January 10th.
This is effective January 10th. That's when the
that's correct.
Board of Trustees passed it.
It can't be both, right?
It's- all the other correspondence is January 10th.
Okay, yeah.
So we have to change this to January 10th of 2023.
So at the same time, then, do we want to correct findings of fact number 5 for that section 4405 to be 01,
Yes.
not 02?
Nope,
Right.
So we're considering that our findings of fact are now corrected for both motions.
That 440502 appears twice in the recommendation and once as stated on number 5 in the findings of fact.
Mhm. That's a note.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, so the motion made by member Cap is seconded by member O'Brien. Roll call, please.
right. Member Bransky,
Yes.
member Cap,
Yes.
member O'Brien,
Yes,
member Johnson,
Yes.
member Castaneda. Chair Sutega,
Yes.
motion carried.
Okay, now for the second.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make the motion for the second amendment for case 24-15 as a recommendation to the Village Board of Trustees. This is to amend table 44-05-01 to adjust off-street parking requirements for places of assembly uses to replace the current requirement for all place of assembly uses. This is to reflect the following language: 1 space per 250 square feet, or 1 space for 4 fixed seats, whichever is greater. And add 3 use categories to table 44-05-01 to include the following new parking requirements. High schools, 1 space per employee and 1 space per 4 students based on stated enrollment over 15 years. And junior high schools, 1 space per employee and 1 space per 10 students based on stated enrollment over 15 years. And elementary schools, 1 space per employee and 1 space per 10 students based on stated enrollment over 15 years. And incorporate the findings of fact into the record.
As amended.
As amended.
I'll second that.
All right, we have a motion by member Bransky and a second by member Cap.
Member Bransky,
Yes.
member Cap,
Yes.
member O'Brien,
Yes.
member Johnson.
Yes.
Member Castaneda,
Yes.
Chair Suzega,
Yes.
motion carries. Thank you.
I'd like to know how much of our Zoom audience we lost to something that's on television tonight.
Probably not.
I wouldn't get it anyway. I'm so busy running up and down the stairs.
So member Johnson's recording it for, so you could look at it later. right?
No, that's what I'm saying. I won't be able to. My wife up and down the stairs. With her surgery.
And she's doing okay.
Yeah, we were there.
Little.
We had to,
Thanks.
So thank you.
Okay.
Whatever happened with the, yeah. The old, animal shelter.
Oh. We drew the application and then I haven't heard anything else.
That's gonna become a haunted place.
Well, you know, there is.
Did the village board ever hear that case or not?
No, they don't do. They go to the board.
Yeah.
They decided not to go forward with it. And then I believe there was a not-for-profit animal welfare organization looking at the space, and I don't know if they, you know, had funds or were able to buy it. I haven't heard from them for a little while, but yeah, that they walked away.
How long is that space been open?
It hasn't been open very long. It's less than 6 months, I think.
Did we make a motion to adjourn?
No.
Oh, my God.
We're not ready
Well,
to
you gotta hit
adjourn
old
yet.
business and new business.
Aye.
All right.
That's what
Who's the second?
I don't think.
I'll second.
All right.
Liz.
I oppose.
You're all up on the corner. Anybody
Aye.
want to stay longer?
I said I oppose.
Well, thank you all.
Great point.
Well, I tried.
No.
They call it.
It's a Sunday, but we still. It shows. Don't think it hasn't been a little slice of that. No, that's done. No, great job. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, good night, folks.
Good night.
Inside of it, no.
Angela.
Drive through.